What's going on, guys? This is Rob. If you guys enjoy my content, make sure you hit the subscribe button and make sure you hit that little bell so you never miss out on my sexy voice. Okay, so we are picking up with Phoenix Resurrection, the return of Jean Grey. Like a quick little story. Myself and Benny were at, myself, Benny, and Gary, the camera guy, were at Emerald City Comic Con. And it's funny because Benny got me all these like variant covers for Phoenix Resurrection. And I was like, dude, that's so cool. But like initially I was like, man, I mean, that's a pretty hefty gift, you know? And Benny's determination, like Comic Story's determination for whether or not I buy something, whether or not I'll like a gift that he gives me, is if I would buy it on my own. And if at any point I say, I mean, I would definitely buy that, then he's like, cool, I'll get it for you. And like, that's that's it. Like we do that back and forth. Like I'll buy him stuff back and forth, which I have a really cool gift in mind to repay him for getting me that, because that was a pretty hefty gift, and I'm pretty sure he'll like the one that I'm giving him. But Phoenix Resurrection is an amazing story because when it comes to stories like this is designed to hit a couple different marks. This is about as close as Marvel has gotten to like a Rebirth-esque kind of thing, in the sense that it hits the mark of like classic X-Men fans, and it hits the mark of like new X-Men fans. Because for a lot of new X-Men fans, they don't really know original Jean Grey. They know like all new Jean Grey from Bendis's run, the younger version that was brought to the present from the past, but they don't really know like classic Dark Phoenix Saga Jean Grey. You know, that's kind of a not really a mystery so much as like an age of comics they're not really a part of anymore. And so this is cool because it creates a bit of nostalgia for those of us who have been reading for a long time, at least for me it does. But initially this opens up with a young girl who's just laying dead in the street. Like, I mean, she's literally bleeding from the head and her eyes are gone, and then she just kind of stands up and then starts talking backwards. It's crazy because what she says is, "We were better off dead." And like, that's wild. Like it's really kind of interesting to see that, because for those of you guys who are familiar with Jean Grey's history, this looks remarkably like the girl of Jean Grey, the friend of Jean Grey who died when she was younger. And that's what this is designed to be. It's designed to hit all these different marks. This girl suddenly rises up, this girl starts, you know, kind of speaking to them, and then you sort of cut to the X-Men showing up about 2 hours later, where the sheriffs have basically contacted them over the fact that a lot of this is kind of weird. Now, there are a couple things that I want you to bear in mind here. The first is that Rachel Summers' nose starts bleeding, and that's huge, because when it comes to like psychic beings in Marvel Comics, one of the ways in which Marvel will often indicate how powerful a being is that they can have like kind of a residual impact on another psychic person, on another person with telepathy or telekinesis or something like that. Nosebleeds are kind of the way they do it. You don't see it all the time. You kind of have to take it for what it's worth. But in this moment, it's basically designed to show that like there's a pretty powerful presence here. Now, the two kids who were there and witnessed this young girl, they're basically collapsed and sort of out of it. And so what this does is it brings together this massive meeting of like all the X-Men related teams, basically X-Men Gold, X-Men Blue, whatever other members of the X-Men are out there that aren't really part of a particular team. But the question that people have is, what's going on here, in the sense that like there's some unusual residual energy being found, but it's actually being found in various locations. One of the things they find is that it's in the heart of Midtown, that is basically in Manhattan. There's another spot where it's in Mont St. Francis, the monastery on the south side of France, you know, and that is on the North Pole. Now, those of you guys who are familiar with Jean Grey's history, you know that these have very particular moments when it comes to like her life and times. That they all have very particular reasons for like why these things happen. We'll cross that bridge once we get there, because there's a few more locations that are going to pop up as things go on. The problem with this is that nobody really understands what it is that's happening. Nobody really grasps what it is that's taking place here. The only thing they really know is that for some reason or another, basically Phoenix energy is being picked up, and they can't really grasp why. Now, as to why these locations matter, when it comes to basically Midtown, that's the former location of the Hellfire Club. This matters because of the fact that while the Hellfire Club is basically defunct, meaning that all of its top members, Sebastian Shaw, people like that, are basically in hiding, and Emma Frost is still kind of considered to be a villain to a degree of the X-Men. This is significant because this was the point whereby Jean Grey, as the Phoenix, was transformed into the Dark Phoenix when she was basically taken by Jason Wyngarde, and he used his powers to effectively manipulate her mind and turn her into a villain of sorts. Mont St. Francis, that ties into the Phalanx Covenant. That dealt with like Cameron Hodge and things like that. For those of you guys who don't know, the Phalanx Covenant is like a story that started like X-Men, I think it was Uncanny X-Men 316, and it ran through like 3 basic story arcs. It was like Generation Next, and then a couple others, I can't remember what they were off the top of my head, it's been so long. But it was basically a story where like the Phalanx Covenant invaded Earth and tried to take over everything. They basically took over a few members of the X-Men's, like, you know, close friends and so on and so forth. But it was a pretty notable moment in the history of the X-Men. The North Pole, if I remember correctly, is the central point for the events of Phoenix Endsong or Phoenix War Song. But the idea is that with the X-Men showing up in these locations, what they basically start encountering are essentially like constructs, basically beings who have long since been dead, existing in various forms, different things like that, but they all start facing off against the X-Men. For example, in the Hellfire Club, it's the Hellfire Club's foot soldiers. Inside of Mont St. Francis, they face off against Seamus Mellencamp, I think it is. And Seamus Mellencamp was actually kind of a weird guy. He had the ability to drain life force, but he was like a Morlock to a degree. And so again, like it's just these little things, these little little tidbits here and there of various characters. But the idea of like classic Wolverine returning as a construct sees him facing off against Old Man Logan. So it's actually pretty cool. Now, they end pretty fast, but what this does is it kind of signifies that there's like this massive Phoenix in the sky, basically meaning like the Phoenix Force is returning. And so what we end up doing is picking up out in the middle of nowhere with Jean Grey. And it's kind of wild because this girl's just sort of there and just kind of working. You know, what we also end up finding out is that there's a guy who's eating at this diner named Cassidy. Now, this is Mr. Cassidy. This is Banshee. Banshee's been dead for years. And so it's kind of crazy because basically what it looks like is people who have long since been dead are coming back to life. And that's why this is so cool. That's why this is written so incredibly well. Not only this girl, Jean, when she goes home, her parents are there. Like her life is basically the same way it was before, only for us to find out that she actually has a date tonight, or at least it seems like she has a date, and she's met by Cyclops. So again, this is crazy. It's so cool. And it's one of the best stories that Marvel's published in a long time. The issue with this is that we end up switching over, you know, a little bit to Jean's personal life. And this is kind of cool because her life is exactly what we would expect it to be. It's quaint, it's basic, it's like Heartland America. You know, that was really kind of the life that she lived. It was really kind of like a carefree suburban life, didn't really have a whole lot to worry about. Now, of course, all that changed when her powers kicked in and she was brought into the fold by Charles Xavier. But still, you know, switching over to the X-Men, there's all these different things that are going on with regards to like this Phoenix persona appearing with like these constructs that are being manifested by some unknown being. You have guys like Cable who are here. And that's a pretty big moment because when you have guys like Cable, what it means is that things are popping off pretty significantly. Now, Cable being here serves the purpose of being able to access Cerebro, because remember, for the most part, not many people can do this. And Rachel Summers is currently out. Like she's basically just sort of collapsed. So Cable's the only one they can really go to for this. Now, the problem is that as soon as Cable taps into Cerebro, and as soon as Cable tries to basically analyze this energy signature that exists out there, his mind essentially shuts down. Like he's basically just taken out entirely. So it's kind of wild to see this happen because again, we're dealing with a massive amount of psychic energy that's going on here. The other half of this is that with the X-Men kind of investigating as best they can and figuring out what's going on, we start going into other things. We start finding out there are more energy signatures that are taking place. The Savage Land in Antarctica, the New York sewers in Manhattan, the ruins of Genosha, Jamaica Bay. All these have significant moments in the life and times of Jean Grey. Jean Grey's death at the hands of Magneto in New X-Men, if I remember, took place in Genosha. The events of Jamaica Bay, that's where we found out that the Phoenix, as it was with Jean Grey, was not actually Jean. That when Jean bonded with the Phoenix Force, the Phoenix actually copied her DNA entirely, duplicated her, and then placed her body in the bottom of Jamaica Bay to keep her safe. All these things have significant moments in the life and times of Jean Grey. Now, while X-23's team is examining one of these locations alongside Longshot, I'm pretty sure, Magneto suddenly appears. Now, this is not Magneto as we know him. This is classic Magneto. And you can tell by the getup, by the outfit that he's wearing. It's really just classic Magneto's outfit. But it is kind of interesting because while they're fighting against Magneto, he suddenly starts rambling off all these nonsensical things. You know, may I get a fresh cup of coffee? Just different things like that. But there was a point whereby in this town that Jean Grey was living in, that Magneto, basically Eric Lyncher, had walked in and said the exact same thing. Can I get a fresh cup when you have a moment? And so it almost seems like Jean Grey is subconsciously manifesting all these constructs and just sending them out there into the world. We don't necessarily know exactly what's going on with all this. All we know is that things are kind of running amok. Now, the other half of this is that it almost seems like this is kind of a mind game of Jean Grey, because while this is happening, suddenly like the Phoenix emerges in the background of this town she's living in, and like everything's going to pieces, and like it's all burning up and it's all setting on fire and everything's kind of coming to an end, and then she's just sort of ignoring it. She's just kind of like, whatever, you know, like there's nothing going on here. There's really nothing there. The other half of this is that as we start to get a little bit more of a tour of the place that she's living in, we end up finding out that there's a guy named Mr. Patch who's basically Wolverine. And it's kind of weird because we know, like historically speaking, when it comes to like Jean Grey and Wolverine, that classic Wolverine always had a thing for Jean, and it created kind of a love triangle, sort of this soap opera mentality that Chris Claremont was always shooting for. When you had Cyclops and you had Jean who were together, you had Wolverine who was almost like the third wheel, but Jean Grey still kind of liked him a little bit, and it was always that question of like, who will she choose, Cyclops or Wolverine? Ultimately, of course, she chose Cyclops, but the fact remains that in this scenario, he actually ends up trying to make a move on her and actually pushing himself onto her. Now, of course, she kind of lashes out using telekinesis, not realizing what it is that she's doing, but still, things are pretty wild here. And so what we end up doing is picking up with the X-Men and basically joining up with Emma Frost. Now, Emma Frost and her team have actually had a run-in with the Phoenix. In the Jean Grey solo series, which is okay, there's basically a point where like the Phoenix entity returns and then essentially like takes out the entirety of like Emma Frost and like Quentin Quire and all these really powerful telepaths. That's actually one of the reasons why Rachel Summers is out, is because she'd responded to that and she was taken out just like everybody else. It's not really an essential read, but again, basically Emma Frost knows that like Jean Grey is alive, that Jean Grey is in New Mexico, that the Phoenix Force is around, that basically everything that's happening right now is happening because of Jean. And that's when we end up switching back to Jean herself herself, and she's basically met with like her Phoenix persona. And that's kind of what it seems to be taking place here is, you have Jean, the person who's living in this, whatever this is, and then you have like the Phoenix persona that's trying to rebond with her. And it's kind of cool because it hits back to like all those early things. Now again, switching back over with the X-Men team, this is like a who's who. This is basically everybody who's involved with the X-Men or has been involved with the X-Men, and even so far as X-Factor, like Strong Guy, anyone who has ever been part of the X-Men universe or part of one of the X-Men teams is basically there. But when the group shows up to New Mexico, they end up finding this massive dome that's sitting out there. And that's when we start to come to the realization that this whole life that Jean Grey's fashioned for herself isn't real, that it's basically her using the Phoenix to alter reality and make all these things exist, basically create like a self-contained world for herself. Now again, with like everything burning up, everything being on fire, Jean Grey doesn't seem to notice or care. As far as she's concerned, everything is normal. It's one of these things where like these flames follow her everywhere she goes, but they're only, for whatever it is that she's not looking at. So like when she looked at this guy that's riding by on a bicycle, behind her, everything's burning, but when she looks back at that guy, everything's normal. So again, it's kind of wild. It basically hits at this idea that there's the reality and then there's what Jean Grey perceives it to be. So again, this is pretty intriguing and it's pretty awesome here. Now, of course, once the group starts to make their way into this location, they end up seeing things as they really are, whereby everything's basically kind of burning up and everything's basically being destroyed by the powers of the Phoenix. Now, all these constructs are also being manifested too, but they end up finding out that the place where Jean Grey is working at, this diner, is called Annie's. Now again, Annie was the name of Jean Grey's friend that died in her childhood. Annie was basically the catalyst by which Jean became the Phoenix. The Phoenix first took notice of Jean because of the fact that Annie died when she was a little girl. She was involved in a hit and run accident. She was basically killed, and the result was that Jean let out this psychic backlash. Charles Xavier picked it up, and the Phoenix Force picked it up. It was basically Annie setting all these pieces in motion, setting all these things in motion. And that's why one of the people here, the closest friend Jean Grey has, is Annie. Annie is still very much alive in this reality that she's created. It's like the one regret Jean Grey has, the one thing that she wished had never happened, that her friend hadn't died. And it's almost an answer to the question, what if Annie hadn't died? What would the world look like? Now, the other half of this is that Jean doesn't see the X-Men being there. She doesn't recognize them there because as far as she's concerned, there's nothing going on outside of whatever it is that she wants it to see, meaning that reality is basically made up of her own mind. Now from here, it steps into the realm of a lot of like haphazard guessing, because remember, when it comes to the Phoenix, it's kind of contextual. For example, what you had was like the Phoenix 5, for example, during like Avengers versus X-Men. The Phoenix 5 was cool, but like all 5 of those guys basically possessed the power to manipulate reality. They were just godly beings. They just kind of existed on Earth and did some stuff. With the full unbridled power of the Phoenix, one thing to bear in mind is there's only one Phoenix Force, but there's a host for the Phoenix in every single universe. The Phoenix Force is an omniversal force. The Phoenix Force is designed to represent the sum total of all life that has ever, currently does, and will ever exist in the multiverse, not just a universe. That's why the Phoenix Egg played such a prominent role in Jonathan Hickman's Secret Wars and the events of Avengers and New Avengers, because there's only one Phoenix Force in the whole multiverse. And so that's the idea, is that Jean Grey was the host for the Phoenix in the main Marvel universe, but like other people would be hosts for the Phoenix in other universes. But of all the people who have ever been a host, Jean Grey was the most complete host. She was the best person suited to be the host for the Phoenix. And so the idea is that where the X-Men sit down and they start looking at this, while a lot of it's theoretical, in reality, if the Phoenix chose to, it would obliterate everybody here, wipe out the entirety of the planet Earth, probably even snuff out the universe if it wanted to. The group basically has to come to the realization that they're dealing with a level of power that is nigh omnipotent in a lot of different ways, that for the most part, it can't be easily taken down. So what ends up happening is you have Old Man Logan who walks into the diner and starts talking to Jean Grey. But where most of the X-Men wanted to walk in there and say, hey, look, Jean, you have to wake up. You have to realize what's going on. Instead, Old Man Logan walks in there and basically realizes that Jean is just terrified. She has no idea what's going on. She's a scared little girl and her mind is exceedingly fragile, because if Jean is pushed in the wrong direction, she'll rebond with the Phoenix Force and then kill everyone. And so Old Man Logan actually plays it smart by going in and saying, hey, look, I know you're terrified. I know you're scared. I know you're unsure about what's going on, but that's because none of this stuff here is real. While he does kind of do what most of the X-Men would have done, there's a little more tact to it, which is kind of ironic when you think about that with Wolverine. Wolverine's never had tact. Wolverine's always been like, okay, cool, so there's a bad guy, let's go kill him. Snicked, and that would really be it. Old Man Logan, in his experience and his wisdom, the years that he's been around, has learned that you can't solve every problem by just running in with adamantium claws and tearing it up. But the problem with this is that Annie kind of speaks up and says, you have to get out of here, you're not supposed to be here. And that's when Old Man Logan breaks into his classic self and just kills her. Basically just takes out Annie and destroys her entirely. And what this ends up doing is this basically ends up like forcing Jean Grey to face the reality of the situation. Because what happens is Annie basically manifests. She essentially returns to life. And that's when Jean Grey has to face the fact that none of this stuff is real. Now that's when all of Jean Grey's memories begin to sort of flow back and return to her. Now these memories begin to return by extension of the fact that she was the Phoenix in the Phoenix kind of, harbors and holds all these memories. That's the reason why Jean Grey seemingly never really seemed to know what was going on, is because the memories of what her life used to be were held within the Phoenix. But with the two of them rebonding together, she basically returns as the Dark Phoenix. But it's kind of an inner struggle, because what ends up happening is Jean Grey is trying to cast the Phoenix off. So again, this is very much a tribute and very much sort of a throwback to the old Chris Claremont stories. So the idea that like the Phoenix wants Jean Grey to do something, Jean Grey doesn't want to, there's this inner fight between the two, but the Phoenix uses a myriad of different devices to try to sway Jean Grey. Her parents appearing to her and saying, hey, look, everything here is real. You can have anything you want. Embrace the Phoenix and the world can be what you want it to be. And that's true. With all the power the Phoenix has, Jean Grey could just remake reality if she wanted to. And so what ends up happening is Jean Grey basically casts them out and then essentially has this heart-to-heart, face-to-face conversation with the Phoenix. But the last little weapon the Phoenix pulls out is actually Cyclops himself, where he basically says, look, we can go back to the way things used to be. We can have things the way they were before. Before all this happened, before I died, before you died, we can all go back to the way things the way things used to be. But Jean Grey actually kills him. She actually says, no, this is not how things are supposed to be. I miss you, I love you, but you're not supposed to be here. You're supposed to be dead. And so again, it's pretty beautiful and it's done pretty damn well. It's basically sitting down and saying, Jean Grey is this character that's existed for decades. And yes, she died. She died some 8 years ago roughly, and Marvel wants to bring her back. But there are aspects of Jean Grey's past that Marvel has to reconcile with. Cyclops is dead, and he basically has been since the events of like Inhumans versus X-Men, as terrible as that story was. Like, he's basically been dead since then. And so the result is that Cyclops can't exist right now. I mean, I guess maybe Jean Grey could have brought him back, but it would have been too much. It would have been too much of a return, too many things coming back, because what this would have done in the eyes of fans is it would have opened the door that Jean Grey would have just turned into a retconning machine. It makes things kind of tragic with the idea that like, while it would make sense for Cyclops and Jean to be together again, and it would be a throwback to old school fans, at the end of the day, it's just too much. And so what ends up happening is Jean basically destroys Cyclops, destroys his essence, and essentially tells the Phoenix, look, I know you want to bond with me, I know you want us to be together, but we can't. And it's kind of funny because the Phoenix Force is almost being treated like an ex-boyfriend. And that's where the Phoenix really kind of comes out and just speaks directly to Jean and says, do you not understand? We can transcend all of this. We can return to the way we were as the White Phoenix of the Crown. We can go back and we can do anything. We can be gods. We can control all things in existence. The world can be whatever we want it to be. You don't have to deal with, all these crazy things that were going on. You can just go back to a much simpler life when you were Marvel Girl and you were part of the X-Men team and that was it. You can do whatever you want with this world that you live in. But Jean's response is no. That's not the way things need to be. That life progresses, life moves forward. You can't stay in the same place forever. Things change. And so what she ends up doing is just kind of casting off the Phoenix, basically casting it aside and returning back to her previous self as Marvel Girl, the way she used to look back in the 1960s by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comments Explain, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like. And also, Jesus, this story's so good. I mean, this is one of those times where I tell you guys, like, buy this thing. I mean, it's a damn good story. It's one of those stories that'll kind of bridge into like whatever Marvel's doing next, the fresh start or whatever that is. And it actually leads into X-Men Red, which I'm really kind of digging right now, to be honest. But it is cool. So let me know what you guys think down in the comment section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.